we can move to the panel discussions, and I would love to invite here Mr. David Marsh to start the session on the global macroeconomic outlook. Thank you, David.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Marsh. I'm going to be introducing our panelists. First of all, Charles is the Deputy Chairman of Partners Group from the United States. We have Pierre Boivin, who is in charge of global investments and the Global Investment Institute at BlackRock. And Jean has a distinguished career at the Bank of Canada, where he was one of the deputy governors. We have Jürgen Ordinius from PGIM, which is Prudential of the United States. And Jürgen is a citizen of Germany and studied in Bonn University and now ranges over the world. And then Hans Timmer from the Netherlands, who is the economist at the World Bank, looking at this part of the world, looking at Asia. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here. And I've come across CROSAP in the past. And I think if an institution like CROSAP didn't exist, we would have to invent it, because it really is necessary for the private and the public sector to pool forces in this co-investment area. And working for a group called OMFIF, I'm particularly delighted to find other groups with similarly easy to understand and easily pronounceable acronyms. I think we people do need to stick together, to get together with groups like the IFSWF and so on. We obviously do belong together in a linguistic sense. So we are going to be talking about what's going on in the world economy, but not from a theoretical point of view, a view that is very much geared to all the preoccupations of you in the audience about finding returns in a low-return world. We've just had the news from Japan that the MPC at the Bank of Japan has kept its interest rate unchanged at minus 0.1%. They're not going further into negative territory, but they have adjusted slightly their target for 10-year government bonds in terms of the interest target. So it's quite clear that quantitative easing in Japan is going to carry on for a long, long time to come. And we also have that regime taking place in Europe and in the United Kingdom. There are a number of elections and referendums coming up in the advanced world which are throwing a pall over markets. And then there's a general question of where is the growth coming from. We're not going to have a dialogue here just amongst ourselves. We're going to try to involve the audience as well, even those of you sitting near the back. But just to start off, I'm going to go through the panelists in alphabetical order. Jean Boivin, now at BlackRock, looking at some of the longer-term developments affecting worldwide investment. You've been a central banker. You may well go back to becoming a central banker. People move these days between sectors. If you're telling your clients where to get returns, given this rather fragile environment, Chairman Muzanov told us about the difficult times, what 3 or 4 factors do you bring into your considerations, and how do you actually find them a space to navigate through this extremely difficult environment?
Great, thank you very much, David. Very, very happy to be here. And maybe let me start with a couple of, there's a lot to be said on your question, so we'll start with a few ingredients and build on that. But I think maybe to help you understand where we're starting from and the kind of framing we put on the outlook at this stage, we think that we're at a pretty crucial juncture where things are reaching some inflection points, pretty significant inflection points. And I think, one way to start it or to frame it is, a lot of you've mentioned the BOJ, we got the announcement today. A lot of these central bank policies, which have been part of at some point in the last few years, but a lot of these central bank policies were making some assumption that at some point we would see inflation coming back and we would see growth picking up. I'm not sure we have that many more years to wait before we get that outcome to materialize. And if that's not coming, then I think it calls into question pretty fundamentally the kind of paradigm we are in at this stage. So I think we see basically two key inflection points that will have to occur in the very near term, and by that I mean over the next couple of years. One is either we see some reflationary dynamics firmly taking hold in the world, or else we need to see some significant recalibration of global policy. And as a result, the implications for market could be pretty significant in either cases. And in the background of all this, as you mentioned, I think there's also inflection points that are pretty material in terms of the politics, erosion of political cohesion globally, which I'll probably leave aside, but that's another key theme. So we can spend maybe a couple of minutes or an hour later on what's the evidence, but I think we see both of these inflection point evidence of that happening. So I think there's some sense in which we're seeing some reflation dynamics taking hold. I think it starts in the US more significantly. I think 2016, we've seen that playing out. In particular, one thing we haven't seen in this cycle is the phase where we see a benefit of inflation greasing the wheel of the recovery. We haven't seen that, even the US at this stage. We haven't seen wages picking up. We haven't seen income really providing some support for consumers, and that being the next leg of a recovery. So that is still waiting. It might happen. There's some signs, some green shoots that it might be happening, but we haven't seen that phase yet. That means two things. One is we don't see, as a result, talk about using historical rule of thumbs as applying in this environment. So it's not because it has been 8 years since the last recession that we should mechanically expect one to come. There's still some phases that should occur. On the other hand, there is a question about whether policy is as effective as it should be. The other key inflection point is around policy. And I think there's a big change of tone happening and I think it's happening now. And it's on two fronts. On one, it's around central banks losing ammunition, reaching limits. And I think today we'll see what's the reaction. I haven't had the time to fully digest it.
The market has gone up somewhat in Asia, maybe because they were simply fearing worse.
And the yen has depreciated some, so maybe we'll get some relief from that at the beginning. But I think that in the bigger picture, this is all fine-tuning at the margin, but we are seeing basically central banks questioning what's next. I think it's pretty notable that on policies like negative interest rates, there's no united front. This is not something we'd seen in the other kind of installment of these easing policies. When QE came in, there was a much more united front than there is on the new phase of policies. And the mere fact that there's a debate along the lines of whether the BOJ, what it's doing, the fact that we've lost the plot on what the BOJ is trying to do, I think means that by itself makes these policies less effective. There's a lot more questioning.
Perhaps we could go on to
so
Charles
I think
here.
these two things are pretty key inflection point, and then we can come to what it means, I think, for markets as a result.
No, thank you very much, Jean. There was a couple of points there, Charles. You are an old hand at this game. You also, a little bit like Jean, have interacted with the public and the private sectors in your career. Over the last 40 years, it's been pretty rare. In fact, it's not happened at all that we have been longing for a burst of inflation. Central banks have, on the whole, been trying to keep down inflation. Now, we've talked of green shoots as getting inflation. Do you think, a little bit like Jean has been alluding to, that there may be a turnaround here? There's a lot of money being pumped into the system. If Mr. Trump wins the election, or even if Mrs. Clinton wins, there may be a lot more spending of a Keynesian type in the United States. Do you think the one thing that central bankers are wishing for, i.e. more inflation, we might get a bit too much of that coming along?
David, I think, first, it is indeed a great pleasure to be here in Baku and to participate in this second CROSAP gathering. I still think we do need to work on the acronym, but I think it's a great group of sovereign wealth funds and pension funds, and of course those of us representing GPs are honored to be here. I do think that you need to be careful what you wish for in this world, because I, like Jean, I see inflation coming, but I see a more ominous form. I don't suggest that history will necessarily repeat itself, but I do recall firsthand the rather inept environment in which the U.S. tried to promote recovery in the U.S. economy in the late 70s after the quadrupling of oil prices. The result was a rampant period of high inflation in the U.S. which led to a serious devaluation of the dollar, huge current account and fiscal deficits. We at the Treasury Department were forced to borrow in Deutschmark and Swiss franc because we had no liquid reserves to defend the dollar. It was a rather desperate moment. I remember very clearly when Paul Volcker returned prematurely from the IMF World Bank meetings in 1979 in Belgrade, then Yugoslavia. And I was told to pack my bags on 2 hours' notice and get on the plane, and I was totally confused. But I was a young man. I did what I was told. I packed my bags. I said, Mr. Chairman, why are we going home? We're going to kill inflation. And are we at a point, is this inflection point, which Jean mentioned, a more ominous moment of financial repression? I think it could be. I think actually that we are facing such high levels of debt in the Western world that it is greatly worrisome that governments may either by design or by default deal with this through a period of inflation. It's hard to see alternatives which are compelling. And I think this will really pose a challenge for us in the investment environment. I'll use a final analogy, David, and then perhaps we can turn to our colleagues. In 1896, a famous magician was touring Nova Scotia, Jean. And he is known for being the world's probably most famous escape artist. Harry Houdini is his name. Hungarian-American magician. In those days, he wasn't an escape artist. What did he do? He levitated people. He actually had a partner who could levitate in the air without any support. But he came back on a ship from Nova Scotia to New York, and he lost his levitation equipment. And he was no longer able to levitate people. Is Janet Yellen, is the Bank of Japan, is the ECB, are they about to lose their levitation equipment? I think so. I think this is what is happening. The game is nearly over, in my view. I think there is a growing sense among central bankers as well as in markets that the benefits of this ultra-low negative interest rate policy are increasingly being outweighed by the negative implications. Banks are under tremendous pressure. Pension funds are being destroyed, or at least severely damaged. Insurance firms are finding it very difficult to manage their longer-term assets and liabilities. And savers and pensioners are doing what you would expect. They are restraining consumption, particularly in Japan and Europe.
Well, that's really thought-provoking, Charles. We will come back to all those points, and also I'll put you on the spot a bit later on about the US elections, but thank you very much. The end of levitation, you heard it here first. Jürgen, you come from Germany, and you've got a rather classical name, Ordinius, although you're working now in the United States. Do you think also the central banks, through this massive stimulus over the last 8 years, which hasn't really worked in lots of ways, do you think this is also storing up all kinds of problems for the future, which our ladies and gentlemen in the audience should really be watching out for? And if so, at a time when asset prices do seem to be pretty overvalued in lots of ways, what is a defensive strategy that you would be recommending to our delegates here?
Well, thank you. I find it fascinating that we have a panel where actually the first three economists seem to be thinking alike. Because I was going to make a comment earlier that I had it in the back of our mind to say you put two economists in a room and you should be expecting to get at least three opinions. But that doesn't seem to be quite the case here, and I heard the word ominous moment. I share that very much. Why is it that we now all want inflation? I mean, let's look at the underlying things, and I'll come back to your question, David. There's record high leverage. There is adverse demographics. There is low to potentially absolutely no productivity growth, depending on what economies you're looking at. And then, of course, we have also seen a deflationary moment in the world, although here we can disagree on how extensive that was at the time and how dangerous it is. But the reason why we care about inflation is simply because the usual remedies are not there. You could address the debt overhang, and there's undoubtedly a massive debt overhang in the world, and in certain pockets more so than others. You could address that through structural reform. That's very easy. But it's not happening in the key economies. Look at China right now. Key question is whether leverage will stop and the enterprise sector will be reformed. Apparently, at this point, we don't know what the answer is. It may still come. We hope it will still come, but it's needed. Look at parts of Europe not happening, and I would also throw in the US into the mix here as an area where we haven't really seen enough structural reform lately. You could point to fiscal adjustment and just say, well, if we have too much debt, a lot of the debt has been amassed by now onto the public sector balance sheet. That's easy. The public sector now does the adjustment. Well, is it happening? Political costs. I only would say look at the periphery and see how many governments have been thrown out of office as a result of the political costs.
You're talking about the periphery in Europe here,
yes,
countries like Greece, Spain, Portugal, and so on.
Portugal being a case in point here, but also even Ireland, a success story, having had political difficulties at the last.
So would you generally avoid Europe as in terms of asset allocation?
I'm sorry?
Would you generally avoid Europe in terms of asset allocation?
No, we wouldn't, but it's a question of your time horizon. And I'll come back to the bigger picture issue here as to whether the debt is sustainable. But at this point, there is undoubtedly a major Draghi put, but somebody please tell me for how long that's going to be there, and then we know for how long we're going to be there. It seems to be working from an investment point of view temporarily, but we all think we are smart enough to get out of the exit door first. So there's a danger there. Inflation prospects. Since the other remedies don't seem to be working at this point, well, let's have a quick look at the key economies and see what we can expect there. I share Jean's remark earlier that US inflation is coming back. I think the worries about disinflation are overstated in the US. The labor market is tightening, and undoubtedly we will see a closing of the output gap leading to some inflationary persistence.
So if you were in charge of the FOMC, would you raise rates at the policy meeting?
You could have asked me that question more than a year ago, and the answer would have been the same as today, yes.
Yes.
Beyond any doubt, long overdue would be my comment here. But then the U.S. can't be the savior of all in terms of providing inflation to the world. One of the reasons for that is that we are in a late cycle recovery. It may last for quite some time. It may not last for quite some time. I don't have any immediate recession concerns here, but we are running an economic trajectory that is becoming a statistical outlier in terms of length of the recovery.
Okay, sorry, I would like to now go on to Hans, because we will go on a tour d'horizon, and then we'll come back to some of these points as well. Hans, I forgot to say that, of course, your sphere of influence also extends to Europe. You're the economist at the World Bank for Europe and Asia. Looking at this part of the world where we are now, we've got used over the last few years to say Asia, particularly China, is rescuing the world from a period of doldrums. But we now have this slowdown in China, which is infecting other parts. It's all relative, of course. Are you still looking to Asia for being the white knight, so to speak, of the world economy?
I think the short answer is yes to that question, but before I explain more, let me thank the organizers for inviting me. It is really lovely to be back in Baku here. And before I get to China, I want to react to the discussion on low growth, low inflation, low yield environment, which obviously is a gloomy picture for investors. I tend to think it's actually not at the core of the real challenges at the moment. First of all, inflation is probably higher already than we all tend to think. And take Europe as an example. We have in Sweden a central bank. It's very innovative, aggressive, trying to get interest rates as negative as possible. Consumer price inflation last year was 0 in Sweden. But GDP inflation was 2% last year. which is probably a better indicator of what is happening in the economy. And the consumer prices, they are kept low because of big relative price changes in the world economy. Germany, exactly the same. Consumer price inflation was 0 and also 2% rise in the GDP deflator, basically the cost of production in Germany. But there are many other reasons why I think that the concerns about low inflation, low growth, and whether you should stimulate more or whether it's not possible is not at the core. I think at the core is that in the world economy, we are needing several structural changes in economic structure, and we don't know how to achieve that. Or we are seeing changes in economic structure, and we don't know how to accommodate that or facilitate that. And let me give you a couple of examples, and then I'm coming to China also. So the first obvious example is Azerbaijan and all the oil exporting countries. The changes that are needed are enormous. And GDP is not a relative measure, a relevant measure of what is needed. Azerbaijan lost 25% of its income over the last 2 years and has now a decline of 2% in GDP, but that is not showing the real challenge. And the real challenge is that in Azerbaijan and in Russia and in many other oil exporting countries, you need to build up a completely different economy that starts exporting lots of non-oil products. And you need changes in competitiveness policies, you need changes in monetary policy, you have to deal with the problems that are created in the financial sector. And so these changes are much more important than just the overall growth rate.
And is this happening, and is it happening fast enough? Not just in Azerbaijan, but also in other
But everywhere. And I think China is exactly the same. We are all focusing on lower growth in China, but the real challenge in China is the structural reforms. The country is, the growth model of export-led, manufacturing-led growth is running out of steam. And the Chinese government has realized that already for many years. And they're trying to rotate away from manufacturing towards the services sector. They're trying to rotate away from inward FDI towards outward FDI. Big changes in the economy. And actually the low growth in China is something that is probably helpful in that process, is not a problem. So the big challenge is changing the economic structure. One example of Europe, and that's probably in the labor market, that we see big changes. There's not really a problem of growth in Europe when you look at the labor market, because the employment rate is higher now than what it was before the crisis. That's not where the problem is. The problem is the change in the structure of employment. All the additional employment in many European countries is temporary employment, it's part-time employment. Increasingly, we have the sharing economy. People are self-employed. And countries, government, society, they don't know how to deal with that. And you probably need a new social contract. Those are big changes that are coming. And my argument would be that where the opportunities are in the world is not where you see inflation coming back or growth coming back. Where the opportunities are is where you have governments and societies that are good in dealing with these changes.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That's really set the scene very nicely. We'll just have a quick round up here amongst the panelists, and then we will go out to the floor. I think there is a microphone circulating around. But first of all, Jean, it's been actually quite startling and also stimulating that all our panelists seem to think that inflation is coming back again. Jürgen would like to raise interest rates yesterday in the United States. You, as a former central banker, would you agree with this idea that the central banks can't do everything? This is clearly what they're saying. Do you think that there will be some recalibration towards more fiscal stimulus, for example, in Europe, where we see even the very steely Wolfgang Schäuble starting to change his tune on that? And what implications does that have for areas which Canadian pension funds, you are from Canada, are very interested in infrastructure? Could that lead to a bubble and a bursting of the bubble in infrastructure, which is, for many people, a big new area? So could you try to answer that complicated series of issues, please?
No, absolutely, and I think these are absolutely crucial. So I do think, and we've touched on that, but I do think there's been a massive change in tone around fiscal policy globally. There's a couple of ways you can point to that. I mean, Canada has been doing a 180 degrees over the last year, going from a conservative government that was one of the G7 front runner for austerity, and basically is being now completely on the other side of this. So that's one example, but I think this is illustrative of a deeper movement. The G20 communique that came out a few weeks ago, the language that, I mean, this is for the people that care about reading a G20 communique, which is probably me and one other person.
They're all in this room.
But there's a line there that the Americans have been trying to push in these communiques for the last 3-4 years, and it made it to that communique. So, I mean, this is like inside baseball, as we say, but it's or inside football. But this is meaningful, I think, in terms of change. You see that in Japan this year as well, changing. So I think. And the point I would make is that I don't think we should be expecting a big boost from fiscal stimulus, but the mere fact of moving away from austerity, which was a headwind, to a significant headwind, to a minor tailwind coming from neutral to slightly supportive fiscal policy is a significant thing. I think on the infrastructure team in particular, there is a global team that hasn't been exploited. I'm far from thinking of bubble on that front. I mean, looking at all the needs, just in the U.S., the average age of public infrastructure is 27 years. It's the highest we've seen since World War II. There's a lot that can be done on that front. I mean, it's a question about how you finance that smartly, but I think there are opportunities there. For markets in the near term, if that's happening and that change of tone is happening, I think this is potentially a regime change. I mean, it's not like a world where we're going to see a push towards ever lower, longer-term rates. There's going to be potential steepening of the curve. We've seen some of that dynamic playing out over the last 2 weeks. So too early to tell, but there could be a market sentiment change along long-term rates.
Okay, let's go on to Charles. You've given Charles the perfect cue. Steepening of the yield curves, that should be a good thing, I would say. Donald Trump, you are the token American on the panel, Charles. Is Donald Trump going to win the election? And if so, is he quite as bad as everybody thinks he is?
Boy, this is going to be interesting. Who knows whether he's going to win the election, David? I mean, it is, as we sit here today, 48 days or so before the election, it's a very close race. And it is closed up considerably just in the last 2 to 3 weeks. The demographics and the way we elect presidents according to the Electoral College of States, not popular vote, still make it an uphill battle for Donald Trump. So I think it still remains Hillary Clinton's election to lose, but I think, unfortunately for her supporters perhaps, it appears that process could well be a reality.
And also, just following on the theme that Jean very helpfully mentioned, the age of US infrastructure, 27 years, whoever wins the election, do you think there will be an opening up of the United States infrastructure market for, say, foreign investors from sovereign funds? We remember that degree of protectionism around that area 8 or 9 years ago. Dubai ports and so on was not a very pretty sight. Do you think, whoever is in the White House, that the US infrastructure market for foreign investors, including sovereign wealth funds, will be open for business for co-investment?
I think, David, that it is imperative that we galvanize investment in our infrastructure in the United States, and we'll have to do it, whether we want to or not, in a fairly open fashion with regard to foreign investors. This should have moved forward much more actively than it has during the Obama administration. But for a variety of reasons, PPP programs, which have succeeded elsewhere, have not really taken off in the United States. There's still some local union resistance. There's still local municipal authorities who resist losing control, as they do in many countries around the world. But I am hopeful. And I think the urgency of infrastructure investment is quite powerful. I will say that firms like ours have moved into space that we see as increasingly attractive in areas such as renewable energy. We've just made a major investment in solar energy in the United States, in the southern United States, and that company is moving into Colorado as well. We see opportunities in wind. We are a firm believer that renewable energy is not just good in the long term for our environment, but is actually a sound investment for our clients. I agree with a point you made earlier, though, David. One does have to be concerned about bubbles in all parts of the financial asset markets, because we are living in a world where values and fundamentals have diverged. Let me conclude by saying that, of course, no one knows with certainty what a Trump administration will look like. But I think those that are frightened by some aspects of what appear to be his protectionist economic policies should not, in my view, lose too much sleep. I think the realities, and I've seen this many years, I was a junior officer in the Treasury when Ronald Reagan arrived, the realities of the Oval Office are such that what may seem appealing options when you're in a campaign look not so appealing when you're actually faced with the reality of decision-making in the Oval Office. So I don't see the potential of a huge turn inward for the U.S.
Thank you. That's a very wise thought. And of course, I remember back to the days of Ronald Reagan, when everybody thought that this was a prize nitwit, as the English would say, before he became the president, and then he now goes down. His legacy is awesome. So things do change.
I'll give you one small example, David. I was on sabbatical trying to work on my dissertation. I was called back to the Treasury Department. The first thing I arrived, I was met with two senior officials who said, "Young man, develop a plan. We're going to pull out of the IMF and the World Bank." I looked kind of sideways, and I wondered, what are they talking about? Fortunately, one of my bosses, more mature and smarter than I was, said, "Well, Mr. Undersecretary, that's a very interesting idea. Let's study this for 6 months. Let's look at the pros and cons." And, after 6 months, I think it only took maybe 2 months, there was a realization that pulling out of the IMF and the World Bank was not the smartest thing around. You do find people, particularly when there is a big sea change. And Ronald Reagan had followed 4 years of Jimmy Carter policies, which sadly had not worked very well economically. So he wanted a big change. But rationality has a strong way of appearing with a good bit of force in today's world.
Well, that's very, very comforting. Jürgen, talking about sea changes, let's stay on this big political theme for the time being. We're looking now at what could be the ebbing of the power of Mrs. Merkel in your home country. You made a few remarks about Europe, the periphery and so on. Not everything is in best shape. Mrs. Merkel seems to embody the kind of Venus symbolism of world politics, smart, rather understated women in power. We have Theresa May as well now in the United Kingdom. At the other side, we have the strong men. Trump would be one of them. We have the leaders of Japan, or the leader of China, or the leader of Russia, or the leader of Turkey. Who's going to win out in this battle between Mars and Venus? And specifically, where do you see Germany going under Mrs. Merkel? Will she still be the pivotal figure that keeps the European Monetary Union together over the next 4 years?
Well, that's a very good question. The answer is, of course, it's an unknown. That said, for those of us who have watched her over the years amass an unbelievable degree of political power, not only in Germany and in the German party system, but also across Germany's borders, and becoming, whether she wanted to or not, a leader in European affairs. It's hard to see that she, I think at this point, would say, "No, I'm not going to do this anymore." I think that we're looking at somebody here who is par excellence a power politician who has proven to be a power politician. When you look at her track record, she formed a coalition with the Liberal Democrats in Germany and essentially occupied the political agenda that was theirs and pushed them out of parliament as a result of it. She took a 10% bite then out of her coalition partners, the next coalition partner, Social Democrats, political support platform. And now, of course, she has a problem. The problem is that she moved from the center-right to the center, and she created thereby a vacuum on the center-right, and even in a fairly static sort of rigid political system such as Germany's, there's now a party that is trying to occupy that vacuum for the better or the worse. So political competition works, whether we like it or not, and the vacuum is being filled, and that makes her decision-making so much more complicated because now she has two flanks, one on the left, one on the right, and she will have to negotiate both of these. When you look at European politics, well, then it will make maybe a lot more difficult.
But do you think she will still be in office, let's say, in 18 months?
I expect her to run, and I expect her to lead the next government, but I also expect the power politics to change fairly dramatically at this point. Whatever came out of the Chancellery in Berlin went through Parliament.
Okay, well, we are getting slightly near the end of our allotted time, but I'm going to say that we should overrun by 5 minutes, since we started quite late. Now, Hans, you mentioned this issue about the structural changes in China. I deduced from you some relative optimism about where we're going in China, but Asia is clearly much more than that. If you were an asset allocator in this room, whether based in the United States or in Europe or in Asia, would you still tend to overweight Asia for your allocation, let's say, in the next 5 years across all asset classes? I know it's a very broad question, but let's say your bonus depended on it. Which way would you vote?
Yes, Asia, and I wouldn't forget Africa. And one of the reasons is actually the changes that we are seeing in China, because as a result of the change in the structure in China, there are new opportunities in Africa, even in Central Asia, in other Asian economies that are left behind by China not being as dominant a grower in manufacturing anymore. And why I would look at Africa and Asia is that because there you see that societies are still very much embracing the change instead of just bracing for what is coming. And I think that links back to the discussion on politics that we just had. I think ultimately it is not so important exactly the kind of policies that a president in the White House is able to pursue or not. I think what is much more important is the overall political environment. And it's not just Trump. We see it in Europe with the Brexit, with the anti-immigration, and you can argue you see it much broader. If you really want, you can see in Turkey, you can see in Russia, you can even see in China some developments towards more nationalist policies.
Okay, we'll be getting to talk about that later. I believe there is a microphone in the room. I'd like to have just a couple of questions, maybe just before we round off for the photo opportunity. Yes, so gentlemen, I think I can see Christian Friedholm there, very erudite person in the glasses. Does somebody have a microphone, please? Yes, Christian, who of course until quite recently has been the Secretary General of the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds, pioneered that new office in London. Christian, perhaps you could say, to whom are you addressing your question?
Well, I'm Christian Friedholm. I'm now with Danske Bank, and I had a great opportunity with the IFSWF. I'm addressing the question to the panel, and I'll keep it short and simple in the interest of time. So in terms of fiscal policy, would the panel loosen, keep it neutral, or expand fiscal policy at this stage for the global economy? And why?
Fiscal policy. The question was, can one use the space in fiscal policy? to improve matters generally or in Europe across the board? Well, let's go very quickly through this, and we will ask Jean to have the last word. So we'll very, very quickly, almost like a one-sentence answer, starting with Hans. We'll go in reverse order. Fiscal space, where is it? How would you use it?
I think when you talk about fiscal policy, it is no longer about how much, but where you spend. And since we are talking about China all the time, China is the great example, was very effective in 2009 to stimulate their economy. But by doing that, they actually reinforced the old model that they wanted to get rid of, and they frustrated the rotation towards the service sector. Now, more and more in other countries, you will see that also, that just blindly stimulating to increase GDP can actually prevent the changes that you're needing.
Thank you, Hans. Jürgen, particularly in Germany, where the balanced budget has been very much part of the Merkel-Schäuble policies, are we moving away from that? Will we have some pump priming in Germany?
Well, there's plenty of fiscal space in Europe. If you look at Europe as a united entity, unfortunately, politically, it is not united. Europe's fiscal policy overall is very much sustainable. The trouble with fiscal policy in Europe is that it's segmented, that the arrangement is segmented. We have a lot of fiscal room in Germany, but in Germany, thanks to the highly stimulative policies of Mr. Draghi, we don't need any fiscal stimulus. Germany is already growing well above its potential, and as Hans pointed out, there's some underlying inflationary momentum there also on asset prices. So fiscal policy for German purposes would be the wrong tool. That said, where do you need maybe fiscal stimulus or a bit more growth? Well, that's obviously the European periphery. Italy, case in point, but Italy is also the second highest indebted sovereign in the European Union after Greece. So there you have no fiscal space at all. That's to say you need a negotiation of a transfer or of a much bigger picture arrangement, and I don't think that's coming anytime soon. So for practical purposes, there's room, but it will not be used.
Okay. Charles, can the United States do almost what it likes in the fiscal space because of the undoubted exorbitant privilege of the dollar, which is still with us?
Well, I think, there's always enough rope to hang yourself, right? When you are the reserve center of the system, of course, you can try in the short run to stimulate, but the reality is that we did double our debt relative to GDP over the last 8 or 9 years, and the scope for a very stimulative fiscal policy, in my view, is limited. I think more importantly, we should look at tax reform and regulatory reform, infrastructure, targeted infrastructure spending, leveraging the capital of the private sector here, not massive fiscal stimulus. I might have a slightly different view on Europe, although I take the point that, to me, Germany has missed the boat by maybe 4 or 5 years in terms of when it could have stimulated or should have stimulated. There's little fiscal room in Japan and in most emerging markets. So I'm afraid that we have to look at tax reform, regulatory infrastructure, and coordinated policies. We've lost the art of coordination, David, and it seems to me that this has been an unfortunate negative in the current global scene.
Jean, last word from the BlackRock Global Institute. Surely it comes back to that word you used early on, recalibration. One needs, in the best possible world, a reining back of this very accommodative monetary policy, and you need simultaneously to have a slightly more expensive fiscal policy. The trick is to do that in a synchronized way without the markets getting into a panic because the monetary accommodation is going to be withdrawn. So how do you manage that particular recalibration trick that you were talking about earlier on?
And getting to the point of whether there's space or not, so 3 quick point, one-liner. There's never a case for reckless fiscal spending, and I think the danger of having this discussion is it could be interpreted as a green light. So that's first point. And I mean, in Canada, when we look at what's happening, there are question. So it needs to be smart spending. Infrastructure is one of them. Second quick point is we, in my view, had the wrong calibration of policies over the last, since the crisis. Over-reliance on monetary policy as a result, so we were putting on the brake and the accelerator at the same time without thinking about the right coordination between the two. So that's second point. And there's a lot of downside of having low rates for long like we've seen. The pressure on pension funds and insurers and so on is real and massive. It has one benefit, which is it's creating lower debt servicing costs. There's a saving happening for the fiscal authority. And that's a form of space that has been created by a low-rate environment that I'm not sure we have fully acknowledged or taken on board. For the U.S., it's $1.4 trillion of interest rate cost saving that we have because we're in a lower-rate environment. So that provides some room for thinking about better calibration. And if you would rely less on monetary policy, there's going to be less low rates, less complaint in Germany for ECB easy monetary policy, less pressure on the ECB, and more support from the fiscal side.
Good, well, thank you. We've rattled through the world economy, ladies and gentlemen, in a record time. We've gone from China and Russia and Turkey through to the United States and Europe, and we've even mentioned Africa. I think, for me, the leitmotif has been the end of levitation and the beginning of recalibration. That will be the slogan that we will take with us now into the photo session and the coffee break. Thank you very much, Hans, Jürgen, Charles, and Jean. I think it's been exemplary that we've managed to go through all these thoughts in a relatively short space of time. You now, ladies and gentlemen, have your reward of being photographed, and then you have a cup of coffee. But please, let's have a big hand for the panelists. Thank you.